Hello and welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thanks for joining me today. Our guest today is David Crisante. David is the director of Future Science Talks and the Sydney Comedy School. He's one of Australia's most prolific educators in public speaking and works with science professionals to master their storytelling technique so that they are more effective when communicating with stakeholders. He runs the world's only science comedy program, and in 2024 it was rolled out nationally, featuring in all capital cities and many regional centres. Over 200 researchers from almost all Australian universities have participated in the program and featured in major arts festivals. David is currently writing a handbook for CSIRO Publishing on effective science communication for public audiences. David's career history includes working as the head of media, stakeholder engagement and fundraising for 4 science and health organisations. He was also a speechwriter for politicians and crisis response specialist while at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. His career began as a journalist with the ABC and SBS, as well as an international correspondent in Tokyo for several years. He also runs one-on-one sessions as well as courses including bespoke activities for teams across Australia. Thanks again for joining us. I really enjoyed the discussion today with David. The communication topic is an important one and I'm grateful for David's time today. But as always, enough from me. I'll hand over to my guest today, David Crisante. G'day everyone. Welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us again. Today my guest is David Crisante. How are you, mate?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Oh, mate, I'd like to thank you for coming along. And the discussion today is on developing leaders. And before we started recording, I asked you to give me a sense of your background, which I'll share with the listeners when the full podcast drops. But in a nutshell, the topic of my podcast is around developing either leaders or entrepreneurs. And with your indulgence, I think I'll focus on this discussion, if it's okay, on developing leaders. So in my travels, I've had a lot of feedback around communication being key, and that is a core of developing anyone, let alone leaders. But one thing that I've not had a lot of insight from guests on, and it's because I haven't asked, not that I don't have an insight on this, is tailoring your communications to an audience. And so that will be where I start is, in your mind, why are comms important? And then why tailor your message to an audience, or what value is that to a leader?
Yeah, I mean, big question. Interesting question, sort of what I've dedicated my entire career to. So, yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the people that I work with, I don't think they necessarily tailor their talk to their audience in the sense that they often think about what they want to say, right? Because it's really important what they have to present. You know, they've got their entire career behind them and they've got a lot of experience. But often with the audience, it's the first time that the audience might be seeing or interacting with that person. And the audience has their own story and background and all of their things going on as well. And the audience in that scenario, whoever it is, whether it's an individual or a group of people, they're the most important person that is part of their life, right? So if we're able to connect with the audience based on what the audience wants and needs, then we can trigger interest, we can find a common ground with them, and we can get their buy-in. And once we've gotten their buy-in or we've developed some rapport with them, actually, we don't need to sell our idea. They've already bought into us. They feel connected to us, or they feel connected to emotion, and they feel connected to our success. And what's really interesting is if we can communicate really well about their needs, often they will see something of themselves in us. And when you get to that position, it's really powerful because you can, I don't know, you can basically generate so much goodwill from other people and so much support from them that it's almost difficult to fail.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think what stands out to me in the discussion around good communication from leaders to those that they lead is discussions around things like painting what the goal is, being able to sell what your why is, and that will depend on the leader or the entrepreneur in question. But I think you've opened my thinking a little bit around this, in that if you can get people in with good, genuine communication, then selling all the rest of it gets a lot easier because what I've discovered in my travels, for what this is worth, is the more honest a stakeholder you are amongst those that you're dealing with, whether they're direct reports, whether they're your board or whether they're your membership, if they know they're dealing with someone that is honest and open and can keep confidences, then it builds a really strong platform for everything else that follows. And it's amazing to me how often, sorry, very, very seasoned leaders forget that bit of the process. It's almost like until someone reminds them you need to be good at communication or at least practice it, it sometimes goes into the back of your mind. So I guess my follow-up question would be, to what extent do leaders need to refresh themselves on what good communication looks like? Do you need to wait for the proverbial to hit the fan, or is it only when someone lets you know that your communication is not good is when typically leaders go back to it and go, oh shit, maybe I'm not so good at this. Maybe I need a refresher in this. Well, what have you found in your travels, David?
I think people can often feel quite self-conscious when they're in a position of leadership. There's a lot of people looking up to them or looking at them, and they've got time to fill, whether it's in a meeting or another context, and they feel that they need to bring something to the table. And that can really be a lot for a lot of people, and can make you feel nervous and puts pressure on us, and all the rest. And one thing that I do is I work with a lot of performers on stage. So I actually train, scientists. I put them on stage. We do talks across Australia where they communicate about their science and they add humor to it. And what's really interesting is a lot of the time they're incredibly self-conscious. They're worrying about how well they're going to go, and all the rest. And very late in the training, I sort of position it the other way, that their talk is really a gift to other people. And the knowledge that they're giving to other people, they're not being assessed on that knowledge. Other people are taking it in and taking it on board. And so if we can, as communicators or as leaders, focus a little bit less on ourselves and a little bit more on the other people, it's a segue to then communicate about what it is that you're talking about. Um, One thing that I do, which sounds like bizarrely related to this, is a lot of wedding speeches. I help a lot of people craft a wedding speech. And, at a wedding, obviously the people getting married is what everyone's there for, and they are sort of the leader of the wedding. And so often the wedding speeches that I read at the beginning don't necessarily acknowledge everybody in the room, doesn't necessarily thank everyone from being there for what they're bringing. And I immediately read it and can see that the person is putting a lot of pressure on themselves, that they need to come up with something that is impactful in some way, in shape, or form. And what's interesting is once we can tweak their talk so that it actually acknowledges those people in the room, acknowledges how great it is to celebrate something together, then it seems to free up the speaker, and they feel able to talk about all the things that they actually really want to talk about. Whereas before they almost were defensive when they were talking about it. Now it feels communal. Now it feels like I've set the scene, I've acknowledged everybody, we're in this all together. Now, how do we go forth and conquer? And I think that can be really powerful for a leader, to acknowledge others, their contribution, what led to the scenario being where it is today, and then talking about the next steps. And people can naturally see themselves in that story without explaining the story and then having to backtrack and explain where everybody fits in.
Yeah, this can go down some very interesting rabbit holes here, mate. There's a few things that stood out in that response to me, and some quality thinking there is around when you get up and give a presentation. I don't care what the context is, and I'm guilty as this as anyone else. You do think you're being judged by the damn audience. And a lot of times, if you're being asked to give a presentation, people want to hear what you have to say. Now, yes, there's some polish needed with the delivery. Yes, some for me, self-deprecating humor is great. Just humanize yourself a little bit, and don't worry so much about the judginess. And I don't think, okay, this is a personal view. I don't think you're ever going to drill out of most humans that when you get up and give a presentation that there isn't some degree of judgment. And I think where that comes in is more around, did you make us feel included in this presentation? Not so much the content. Because when you ask people that are conference veterans, and I've been to a lot of them, I tend to remember the first and the last presentation, and there's a psychological underpinning for that. You tend to that primacy and recency. You remember the first, you remember the last thing, and in a particular event or a sequence of events, and then you do remember those that stand out in terms of what did this presenter do that made me go, oh shit, okay, they really have something to say. That first observation from me. The next one, when you're talking about setting the scene, is yeah, I think you do get more interested in what someone has to say when they set the scene and bring you into the conversation rather than to say, here's David or here's Eric. They're going to give you the breadth of their wisdom. Don't give a crap about anything else that's happened in the environment. Just listen to me because I've got something really important to say. And I would ask you this: do you think you need to be a polished presenter to get to a point where that becomes instinctive when you present? As in, this is not a natural ability people have; it's something that is learned over time. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think we all learn over time, but we learn in different ways. When one thing that I did a very long time ago is I used to teach kids in Italy and Japan, and I've sort of always been in the arts as one of sort of had two careers. One's very serious and one sort of in the background being in the arts. And some of these kids, just the teachers would comment, oh, they're more charismatic. And what's interesting is I think charisma is something that we don't necessarily define, but it's when somebody puts themselves out there and they get rewarded for it. And they learn at a young age that doing that behavior works. Other people warm to it and like it. And there's no reason why, when we're older, we can't learn the same patterns of behavior because all of us, we all have our good friends and we all behave in a particular way when we're with our good friends where we're relaxed, we're showing our best selves, we're smiling, and we're encouraging them, we're building things together, we're just the best version of ourselves. And then we go into a professional context where the stakes are high and we turn into someone else and we have a different way of speaking and presenting. And what's really interesting is when we're with our good friends, we have an equal status with them. And that equal status helps us to feel really comfortable. And when we're at work, there's all these other statuses that come into play. And you mentioned conferences. At a conference, there are lots of statuses. Especially if somebody's speaking, they have a different status to the audience. But what if that audience was full of your best mates? How would that talk that you've just written or that you're about to deliver, how would it change? Would you feel comfortable giving that exact talk that you wrote in that particular way if it was to your best mates, or would you want to change the content? And I think what's really interesting is when I pose that question to people, it's like a light bulb moment. They often change quite a lot in terms of their content. And what's most impactful is they change their delivery because often especially if you're looking at multiple presenters, you might remember less their content and more their vibe. And because you remember their vibe, then you remember their content, or there's something more, something that makes you feel warm towards them. And again, you see a little bit of yourselves in them. That's why in most literature, there's always a hero because we see a bit of ourselves in that hero. And so what's really interesting is when you see heroes in this literature, they don't elevate themselves. The best heroes are the ones that actually elevate others to their status. So their status isn't low, but it's not so high that it can't be reached. So that sort of ability to walk into a room and to make other people feel important. When I have worked with some really senior people, some celebrities, and they do that, and you see people's, some politicians I worked with did that, and you see other people just feel so valued. That VIP has now just got a new supporter, and all that they've done is treat that person like they would treat a good friend.
Yeah, and you've brought this up a couple of times. The ability, capacity to tell a story is really important. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but you've said it a few times now as we're talking. And I've actually had some really interesting discussions with people that have shared that the ability to tell a coherent narrative and look at how you communicate as having a beginning, middle, and end. And there are certain reference points you need to be aware of. And I think you're packaging that that quite nicely. But what still resonates for me as someone who's held leadership roles and is always looking to see how other leaders do it better. Because I personally, I want to find someone that I put up as the sort of Mount Rushmore of leadership and try to emulate what they do. Because being realistic here, I look at it that if I'm not constantly learning and constantly looking at how you can get better, then you can get stale real quick. And it's you get to a point in life where I don't really give a crap what people think about me, and I know that I've made some mistakes. So if I can learn from the best, I'll try and find that, and not just in my profession. So I work in the not-for-profit space, and I've worked for members for a long time, and I think it's taken a very long career in some different industries to get to where I am to be able to go right. Members look for certain things from you when you're leading an organization, and what they want most is things like a vision, things like honest communication, and things like being able to point out your own foibles and to bring yourself down to a level that you're no different to anyone else and that you serve a function that they value. And so you take your communication from there. The other thing I note in what you're discussing here, an implicit thing that leaders, I think, mostly are aware of, is when you're engaging, try and make it interesting. Like there are some topic areas in some industries that can just get so dry. How do you make it interesting? And so that idea of would you give a technical presentations to your mates in the same way as a crowd of people you don't know. That's really interesting. I've never heard of that before. I'm going to steal that as an idea because I've never heard it put that way. And yeah, it reorienting your own hardwiring about how you communicate is really important. So thank you for sharing that. And what the question that comes to mind is you've been around the traps, you know, different industry sectors, you've worked in different with different people. Of the leaders you've met, without naming them obviously, because for legal reasons we don't want to be doing that, but of the leaders you've met, give me a sense of the best communicator you've met and the worst, and what did you learn? One thing you learned from both that has helped you be a better communicator in that space to help people in leadership roles.
Yeah, I think it's the focus that is something that is so easy to change, and as in, like what you just said, it's we're the ones making us behave in a particular way, and equally we can unlock ourselves straight away, and we can begin to feel more comfortable trying something, and sort of with that charisma that I just mentioned, we develop a more positive feedback loop to the scenario. Most people hate public speaking, but that's because they've been in this thing where it feels negative. They feel like they're being judged. They don't have the right way to measure themselves. They then ask other people who are not the right people to assess them. It's a bad setup. So if we can be a little bit less focused on ourselves and a little bit more focused on the people that are speaking to us, it's really impactful. So for example, if you ask me a question and rather than answer, I take a pause, I look away, I'm sort of doing it now, we're going to feel a distance and a gap that I'm not necessarily connecting with you. Whereas if you ask me a question and I smile, I look, I engage, my focus is on you, and I try to use one of the last four words that you've said. I just say it. Yeah, I just find a way to say it in the sentence rather than trying to comprehend and think about what you've asked me and trying to say it in the right way. When you're with your friends, you just are. You're not feeling like there's a question and answer and that you're being put on the spot. And if I treat you in that way, then most likely I'm going to generate support from you or be able to move to where I want to move more quickly. One of the challenges when we're selling something, and often we're selling something as a leader, we're selling a vision, we're selling ourselves, we're selling some KPI, whatever it is. The challenge with it is if the audience doesn't have data points on you as the person who's giving out that vision, that sale, then the audience doesn't necessarily understand why they should be doing it or why you in particular. So, when you watch a band that you really like and they're traveling in your city and they mention your city, you just get really excited because they've said your city and you feel connected with them. But if it was a band you didn't know and they said your city, so what? So one thing that's really good with a lot of leaders beyond simply focusing on the people that they're speaking with, when I say focus, I just mean literally paying them attention rather than paying attention to whether they're accessing the right memories or getting exactly the right data. Instead, they're focusing more on the connection. The other thing that's really going to help them is bringing up things about themselves so that they seem like a more 360-degree human rather than somebody who's just got a particular thing that they're trying to promote, do, whatever it is, by letting the audience know that you've got a family or that you've got these things that you enjoy spending your time on. They're going to be really impactful. And in terms of good storytelling, which you mentioned, one of the easiest ways we can tell a good story is by talking about our emotional resonance to whatever it is. So if we're selling something and we're excited by it, we say that. If we're trying to achieve something and we're challenged or we're feeling frustrated by the huge monumental task it is, and we're really passionate about the solution that we have and that we're trying to achieve together, talking about those emotions is going to be much more impactful because we all have the same emotions. And you can develop a commonality with the people that you're speaking with by focusing on how you feel rather than what your point of view is. Because your point of view might be different. And if you focus on that, you might never reach that common goal. But if you focus on a feeling, it's much easier.
Yeah, 100%. One thing that stood out in that response is, and I've been primed for this because when we were setting up to have this discussion, you said you work in that world of comedy, and one thing that I do a lot is watch stand-up comedians, and I don't know if my comedic palette is as refined as others, but I like a different range of comedians because, and particularly stand-up comedians, are really good communicators. And one thing that I've noted, and I'm trying to emulate when I am with groups of people, is the crowd work element of what stand-up comics do. Is that, and there are a few that stand out in my mind that will engage with the audience or pick someone in the audience and ask a meaningful question to that person and then engage them as if they were having that one-on-one chat with a friend, but the whole crowd is in on the discussion, which makes the gravitas of what they're doing, it elevates it to a point where I don't think the crowd is conscious that the comedian's doing it, but they suck you in and you're right there and you're hanging on their every word. And that level of work and what leaders can draw from that, in my mind, is super powerful if you can apply the ideas of what comedians do with crowd work and do that in a corporate setting or do that in an organizational setting. If you can get the crowd in, your team, your people focused, you can lead them almost anywhere. And that there's some power to that. So yes, you get to learn from others. And you've mentioned a few times the reluctance of people to do public speaking. I think it was Jerry Seinfeld that said most people want to be the person in the casket, not the person reading the eulogy, and that screams all sorts of issues that we can't cover here. But I tend to agree that when you're up, and for some reason public speakers are put up on podiums so you're above the crowd, and there's reasons for that, so people can focus on you. But once you separate you from the herd, you stand out. It adds all sorts of pressure that I think people aren't aware of until you're in the moment. So, yeah, I think practice is important there, and not worrying about necessarily what your environment looks like, as long as you're bringing people in to the conversation, which you've shared to this point. So, let me ask you this: as you've gone along and you're learning from the people that you're interacting with, what surprised you about what good communication looks like? Have you had someone you've dealt with, a client that's just said something that blew you away? You went, "Oh, shit, I hadn't thought about it that way." Have you got an incident, a story like that you can share?
I think in terms of people and blowing me away, one of the interesting things that I experience regularly is people feeling so unhappy and almost shameful when they're at the front of a room and they're nervous, yeah. And when you're a senior leader or just a leader in general, I mean, often you don't sign up to that bit. That part of the role isn't necessarily what drove you to get there. There might be other things, and that's an auxiliary element that probably isn't your favorite. And what's really interesting is the way in which body language, can convey so much, because when people are thinking like what I'm doing now, I'm thinking about what I'm saying it carefully, trying to be conversational and you practice what I preach, but I am thinking. What we're looking for is we're looking for discrepancies between what we say and how we say it. And so in terms of being blown away, when I teach body language techniques to people who really don't like being at the front of the room, and I see other people in the room just change their posture because the person at the front just all of a sudden looks so comfortable. Mentally, they're still really disliking it. But by tricking their body, by demonstrating the same, when we're with our friends, we have particular body language. And by emulating that at the front of the room, open body language, think Barack Obama sort of, that big smile, that nice poised, slowing down what you're saying, but really good body posture. Just the impact that it has on that person when they leave, and the buzz that they have that they can do it. For me, they're sort of the moments that I live for, that I get really, like, sometimes I get a bit emotional when I see it and I see the change within them. And, I hope that they're able to keep that. What we do in a classroom, it's so easy to do outside of this class environment. They can just do it straight away, but they don't necessarily have the support. So it is a little bit of doing, sort of trial and error with communication professionals who actually specialize in this sort of impactful body language, connecting with an audience, etc. Spending some time with them and then backing yourself. And I think that's the scary bit. How do you back yourself when you're away and you're giving it a go? And that's where those positive feedback loops and that open body language and all of these other things come in.
Yeah, that's quite helpful. Depending on the person presenting, I guess, and the um, how heavy the content is, can shape that as well. So if the presentation is in any given context is very reliant on numbers or data, there's only so much you can do to sexy that stuff up. But if it's something like strategy meeting, or hey, how are we going to build for the next 12 to 18 months? Sorry for the dog in the background. That it you tailor that to your audience, and I guess depending on the professional here, I'll give my view on this for what this is worth. I don't much care what my audience thinks of me or the message, as long as I'm delivering it professionally, I'm engaging them, and I'm seeking their views, and actually really actively listening. That's about as much as I can do. And I think when you get to that point where you don't care about the subjective bit, you're there to have a conversation and facilitate things. If you can leave your own bullshit out of it, it makes it a lot easier, and it can be fun depending on that audience. And I like the analogy going back to how do you orient yourself in the world when you're with close friends and family or your kids to when you're in other settings. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but as you build trusting relationships in a business context, and I'll use my boards that I've worked with before, I work really hard in the background to create trusting relationship with my board members. So when I get to board meetings, the environment is that friendly environment where yes, you got to get some work done, and yes, you got to get decision made. So that's forefront in your mind. But there is some room for humor, there is some room for catch up, and if you can package that up quite nicely, it can make for very good productive meetings. Now, if you're not managing that, it can blow out the time of the meeting, and sometimes you don't get some stuff done. And I don't think I'm the only one guilty of that. But yeah, I think if you can prep the audience, if they're close to home, makes what you're talking about a lot easier. But if it's an audience of your peers, not necessarily within your sphere, then it adds a different layer of complexity. And yeah, I would agree that it's the suckiest bit about leadership positions that you've got to do these things. If you're being honest, I mean, I've not met someone who goes, the best part of my job is when I'm talking to random strangers all the time and having to present the best me every time. It can be hard going, and I can understand for those of us, and you've probably met them that are more introverted in some senses, or more about that inner self and don't want to sort of be out in the front. It could be really bloody hard. I
Yeah.
think it'd be really hard. And um, thank you for sharing that. That as you've trained people, it's quite an impactful thing on you that you can change someone's thinking around this. But I still reckon practice helps you get over that, because if you're not doing it regularly, I think your skill sets in this area can go a little bit stale.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell everybody there are three things that are going to make somebody a good public speaker. Their expertise, they have to have it. And the good thing is, everyone typically does. The preparation. So the preparation is super key, and that's where most people don't put in the time, and then they get up and they don't have a good experience. But that's like everything that we don't prepare for, right? So when I was working in diplomacy, just as you said, with your board members, that ability to sort of get all on the same page before you have that meeting, it's so valuable. We would have a pre-meeting and then a meeting and then a post-meeting to debrief how it went. And what's interesting is during those times, the main game was to listen. Yeah, listen, observe, learn. And so listening, when I'm on stage doing, because mainly I do crowd work and improvisation. That's what I do when I'm up on stage. And I have to really train myself to listen and to pay attention to the people that I'm speaking with, and not necessarily make it all about me just because I'm feeling a particular way. And I get nervous, and I have good days and I have bad days, but without fail, every time I step on stage, I get nervous and I reset myself. I do the same things with my body language. I stand in the same way. I have a particular posture. I've done it on this podcast, right? There are things that I do with my hands, and it works. It helps me to feel more relaxed because actually I do this posture when I am relaxed. So, you know, being able to prepare is super, super, super important. But you can prepare all you like, you're not going to be as good a speaker as somebody who has practiced. So the trick is, where as part of the preparation, how do we find moments where we can practice all the time? So rather than, for example, thinking of public speaking as a thing, why don't we think of it when we're in presentation mode? Because actually we do that so many times a day. And when we're in presentation mode, we're not our usual selves because we're trying to advocate for something, or we feel put on the spot, or we need to communicate in this kind of clunky way. When I order a coffee, I'm not in presentation mode. When I get a phone call from, I don't know, a family member, I'm not in presentation mode. When I'm hanging out with a friend, I'm not in presentation mode. And all those times I use a different voice than when I'm in presentation mode. I have a different cadence, I appear different, and those people like me. I know that those people in my life, the local barista, whoever it is, they like me. They enjoy my time. And then I get to work and I'm somebody else, and then I wonder, why isn't this quite working? Or I'm feeling a bit insecure. And so for me, being vulnerable is showing more of that authentic self in terms of just who you are, but doing it in a calibrated way. It doesn't mean just going to work and sharing everything, but it does mean thinking about some of the things that you might have done over the weekend and finding a way to lend that to a conversation so that then your team feels like they can, tell you stories and show more of their personality, because we all have a personality, and that personality massively impacts how we do our job. And everybody knows it, whether we're honest with ourselves or not. So actually, what we can do is we can have fun with that and think about how our personality is sprinkled throughout our entire day and all of our interactions, and be self-deprecating about it by acknowledging that we are this type of character. And people actually get a lot of joy out of that. And every sitcom is a series of characters, and every team is the same if you'll allow it to be.
Yeah, that's a good final point there. That you have to let people be who they are, and if you can take the mickey out of yourself and allow others to do the same, I think it relaxes the environment. I've seen some people do that really well. I've seen it go not so well, particularly if it's on about you and you're perceived to be attacking somebody else or having fun at their expense. It's quite a grey area, I think, because those that do it well about themselves ingratiate themselves. If you start bringing someone else's foibles in and look like you're being judgy, then it can really set a really wrong tone. I've seen that go badly as well. But look, we're all humans. I don't think we get this right all the time. And at the core of this conversation, and it's a good reminder for those that follow the podcast or anyone in any line of leadership, whether it's middle management or senior management, is how you choose to communicate is ultimately your decision. How you bring people into the conversation is ultimately your decision. How you manage those relationships when you're in the conversation is ultimately up to you. And whether or not, and this is a really interesting bit you brought up about negotiating, is how do you detox and unpack it afterwards? That's not something I do often, and I think I'm going to apply that when I'm talking to my board next time, is to do a brief after. I sometimes do it with my chair, because that person in multiple roles I've had, those people, sorry, have been critical to my success. If I can't have a good working relationship with my chair, the president, whatever that title is, it makes the job a lot more difficult if you don't have your finger on the pulse of what that leader is thinking, because ultimately you're accountable to that person. And so the debrief bit is very interesting. I don't often do it with other directors, but I'm going to try and do it a bit more and sort of seek that feedback, good, bad, and indifferent, because you need it to get better.
Mm.
That's a personal view. Some may not agree with that. So, final question, David. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. What would be your take home for someone listening to this about being a better communicator as a leader? Maybe your top three bits of wisdom you can share, man.
Yeah, top three, 100% would be think about the way in which you're communicating as a gift to others. If you do Kris Kringle at the end of the year, where everyone gives a secret sort of present, do you want to be the person who's just given a good present? Do you want to be the person who just ghosts from the entire thing and doesn't participate? Or do you want to be the person who just keeps on bragging about whoever gets the present that you've bought, how they're going to get the best present ever? Right. So it's probably like we just want to sort of be that person who's going to give a gift to another person and enable them to do whatever it is that they like, rather than, making a big song and dance of either not participating or I participated, but now it's going to be awesome because I'm participating. You sort of miss the point of the entire exercise. So if we can think more about communicating as if it's a gift, then the people that we're speaking with will feel valued, and they will gift us in return the ability to go deep on whatever it is that we want to talk about without feeling defensive. That would be one. The second thing I would say is, you know, if you're able to think about the fact that it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, that's really going to be a game changer. So often, even in a meeting that goes for half an hour, we'll typically only really want to say one thing. But people are listening to many other things that we're saying because we're always conveying information with our body. And it's sometimes not what we ask for, it's how we ask for it. Or it's not what we're advocating for, it's the manner in which we're doing it. And that's where that pre and post catch-ups can really help. But even doing those pre and post catch-ups, that's still the manner in which we do it. We're showing that we value somebody so much that we're going to invest time in working out how we can do this thing, how I can achieve what I need to achieve or want to achieve in a way that takes them along for that journey. And I'd say the third thing is, you know, we learn so much in life, and ironically, we don't really necessarily learn how to communicate professionally effectively. We get performance managed and a whole bunch of other, or performance managed, performance reviewed and a whole bunch of other things. But even the people assessing us, they might not be that skilled communicators themselves. So if in doubt, go to a professional, go out there and do more things where you're talking about your subject matter in a way that's the stakes are lowered, because either you're doing it with a professional or you're doing it with a different group where your salary is not at risk, and your livelihood is not at risk, and that will enable you to find or to tune in more with who you are and what you want to give to the world.
Words of wisdom, sir. David, thank you for your time, mate. This has been great.
Thanks so much for having me.
For those listening, this has been the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, rest of your week, and we'll catch everyone on the next episode of the podcast.